Hi, I'm Ryan North.
I'm Lori Fungi.
And I'm Sean Wilson. You're listening to Foster Family Matters, a production of CK Family Services. People united through God to enhance the physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being of at-risk children and families.
Welcome back to Foster Family Matters. We are so excited that you decided to join us today and spend a little bit of your time listening to the words that we have to say.
They're good words.
Gosh, you sound like a preacher.
Oh my! You know what? I feel a little bit like a preacher. Everyone, take your Bibles out and turn to James 1:27.
Oh,
is that the right verse?
That's the affirmation for foster care and orphan care verse.
Go ahead and spit it. I know you got it.
The Ryan paraphrased version of the Bible.
Yes.
Religion that God the Father sees as faultless and pure is to care for widows and orphans in their distress and not be corrupted by the world.
Amen. So today we have a first for our show, and I'm pretty excited to introduce our guest, and we will introduce our guest in just a moment. I do want to ask Lori and Ryan how we're doing today.
Doing well. I'm excited. I'm really excited for this content and with having Lauren here and just learning a little bit more about the whole court hearing process and all the legalities that go into it.
Absolutely. I enjoyed that you started using rhyming couplets in the intro. We are excited that you have decided.
Yeah, well, it's very apropos for who our audience is,
yes.
for who our guest is today, I think, or at least if you follow pop culture from 20 years ago.
25 years ago. So Johnny Cochran, obviously the reference there, but I remember we had just arrived in the U.S. about, that was in June, so about 2 months, about 6 weeks before that O.J. Simpson high-speed chase, and I was watching my first ever live NBA finals on television, and I had no idea who O.J. Simpson was. And all of a sudden, I was really annoyed that I was watching a Bronco do 20 miles an hour on a freeway while the NBA was picture in the bottom corner with no sound.
Yeah.
Who is this man?
That would be annoying. So and the reason that it's apropos is our guest today is Lauren Hudgeons, who, in addition to being a foster parent, adoptive parent through CK Family Services, is an attorney and works with kiddos who are in the state's conservatorship. And I think we're gonna get a lot of good information with Lauren today. We're really looking forward to the discussion. Lauren, welcome. Hi.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to get to answer some questions that I get from foster parents. So often, I know that the court process it can just be really intimidating and frustrating for foster parents. And having worn all the hats, I love being able to walk with families through that. So I'm excited to be here today too. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So without any further ado, I think we just kind of jump into it. I know, Lauren, you have made some presentations and you've kind of gotten into a situation. It's one of the things that we wanted to bring you on the show for today. You I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of have a passion for supporting other families that are in kind of going through this situation.
Absolutely. Just, I think because I have been, and let me say at this point, probably about 90% of what I do is adoption and representing children in CPS custody as attorney ad litem. But I have also been a foster parent and adopted twice through foster care. And so just having worn all the hats, I've been able to see, man, why don't they have that information, or why is this happening that way? And so I can answer my own questions now. And so being able to do that, I love to be able to walk with foster families and explain what's going on and just be able to kind of help ease some of those concerns or give them, advice about where to go if there's a real legitimate concern that they need to follow up on.
And that is such a valuable resource to have. I mean, we, as a foster care and adoption agency, so the show goes out to the world, and not everyone who listens is necessarily someone involved in the foster world here in North Texas. But as a foster care and adoption agency, we try to stay abreast of all of the relevant information for the whole landscape of the foster parent and adoptive parent experience. But we're not attorneys, and we don't play one on TV. So it's so good to have you in here today. I had a question that I wanted to kind of ask, and I don't know if this will get things started or it may just be a complete sideline that I edit out later, but guardian ad litem versus attorney ad litem. Like, I've heard those terms before. Are they the same thing? Are they synonymous? Are they different?
They're usually not the same thing. So generally, and that's one of the things that can be so confusing for foster parents, is all of the people that are in and out of their house all the time. And so I think that's a great place to start with just understanding who all of the people are. So usually in most situations in foster care, as a foster parent, you're going to have your agency worker whose job it is to make sure that your home is following all the standards that they're supposed to follow, and then also to check in on the child and offer support to the foster parent. You've got the attorney ad litem. Every CPS case should have an attorney ad litem appointed, and that attorney's role is to advocate for the child. And it should be that the attorney is being the voice of the child, so to advocate for what the child wants, or what we call their expressed objectives, regardless of whether the attorney agrees, if the child is old enough to have an opinion, so that literally the court is hearing what the child wants. Regardless of whether that's in the child's best interest. Now, if the child is too young to be able to form that attorney-client relationship, then the attorney ad litem can substitute it can decide what they believe is in the best interest of the child. And that's similar to CASA or to the guardian ad litem, who's usually in most counties there's also a guardian ad litem appointed. The guardian ad litem's job is to investigate the circumstances and to report to the court what they believe is in the child's best interest. A lot of times that's a CASA. Sometimes it can be attorney as well. And it's interesting to me, sometimes the attorney ad litem and the guardian ad litem are in agreement about what's in the best interest of the child, and sometimes they're not. But those are the different roles. And then you also have an attorney for CPS that represents CPS at those hearings. And then, of course, you have your CPS worker who comes out to the house, usually monthly as well. So that's another important difference, I think, for people. Often they don't understand. There doesn't seem to be any logic to who shows up when. But usually your CPS worker and your agency worker, and often CASA will be there monthly, whereas the attorney ad litem, the family code says that they're supposed to visit before every court hearing, and usually that's going to be about every 3 months. So, and then sometimes people will have trouble with ad litems who don't show up at all, and we'll get to that a little later. But they're supposed to be there before every court hearing.
So you said something when you introduced yourself that I wrote down because it really resonated with me. You said that the legal process can be somewhere between intimidating and frustrating, and I would say that in our experience, when we first became foster parents, it was intimidating, and it moved towards being frustrating.
Absolutely.
And so now, and I think that was our lack of understanding of how that all worked. I think our frustration was certainly born out of expectations that weren't based in anything other than the way we thought it should happen. Okay. And so when we do intern orientation here with pre-service families, Elaine and I go into try to make this point a couple of times, is that the legal process can get frustrating because you're just focused on the child, but there's like so many other things happening in the background. Or there's the case for the child, there's the case the parents are involved in, and a bunch of other things. And we're like doctor's appointments, getting kids enrolled in school, therapy appointments, and it's really fast on the home-based side of it. But the legal system moves at its own pace, partly because there's a lot going on, and sadly, partly because there's a lot going on overall in the system, right? I mean, Region 3 up here, how many kids are in foster care?
Oh gosh, I
mean,
mean
6,000 or something.
Yeah, I mean, if you include kinship care, the number of kids that are in kind of a paid foster scenario is probably just over four grand, and another $2,000 or so that are in kinship care just in Region 3. Which Region 3 is 19 counties, including Tarrant and Dallas counties here in North Texas. So
yes,
it's
populated. Yeah,
it's populated
no
area.
doubt. But we try to like set that expectation for folks right up front that you kind of need to tap your brakes in getting frustrated with the legal system because the legal system and whatever that encompasses, whatever my opinion of that is probably doing the best it can based on the volume and the load on the system.
Right. Well, and it's hard to tell people not to get frustrated when they're emotionally invested.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about our
Absolutely.
kids. So I think it's really natural, but not very productive to get frustrated. Now, there are certainly some things that foster parents can do to try to get involved and to stay involved and stay up to date. I think part of the reason that the process takes as long as it does, too, statutorily, I mean, there are just statutory guidelines as far as we're going to have the adversary hearing within 14 days. We're going to have the status hearing within about a month, and then from that, and then we're going to have the initial permanency hearing within 180 days of that adversary hearing, and then we're going to have what we call permanency hearings about every 3 months after that. And just as a side note, people hear permanency hearings and they get real excited about something permanent is going to be decided. And so just as a side note, permanency hearings, there's really nothing permanent decided at permanency hearings. It's just an update to the court about how the parent's coming on their services, how the child is doing, and just if there are any concerns or anything that needs to happen. But we don't get anything permanent until we get to that. Hopefully that CPS has 1 year before they need to either start trial or start a monitored return. And now there can be circumstances where the court can grant a 6-month extension, but in general they've got a year. And so a lot of times you're going to see that whole year and then an extension sometimes, and then maybe even a little more than that. If there is termination, it may take a while before we figure out what's going to happen for permanency. And some of that in the waiting is just we're waiting to see if the birth parents are going to work their services.
Right.
And so there's no rushing that. There's nothing the court system can do to rush that. It's just kind of waiting to see, are they going to stay clean? Are they going to do what they need to do to be able to get their child back?
Well, and they're granted and allotted that year. I mean, that's their right to, I have this year to prove to the courts, to prove to the judge that I can get clean, that I can get transportation and a good job and a house for the kiddos.
Right. Well, and there are, if you can terminate based on failure to work services,
right,
within 9 months. They have to show that they have not worked services for 9 months before you can terminate based on failure to work services. And there's some other grounds like constructive abandonment, that if they're not doing anything for 6 months and they're not showing up and they're not having any contact and they know their child's in CPS custody, you can do that after 6 months. But the majority of the cases, you're gonna make it to almost the year unless the parent is just not doing anything.
Let me clarify something. Going back to that permanency hearing, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this the first time that conversations are happening about shifting that permanency? So every kiddo comes into the system and the permanency plan is reunification.
Right.
Until we get to a place where that may shift based on parents' inability to complete their service plan or any other subsequent reason. And so at that 6 month, that 180 days, this is the first time that conversations are saying, maybe should we shift that reunification to adoption by non-relative or kinship fictive placement, where those conversations are happening. You're not going to see any action necessarily in terms of the foster parent or what's happening in the court system, but it's just being brought to the table to discuss or to consider. Is that fair?
That's really going to vary by county to county.
Okay.
But I would say, there are some circumstances, like aggravated circumstances, where the goal might be termination right after the beginning of the case if there are aggravated circumstances, which are just, the family code sets out several instances where the department is relieved of the requirement that they offer the parent services and attempt to reunify. And those are things like having had rights terminated before or certain types of abuse and things like that. So there are circumstances where the goal might be termination from closer to the beginning, but the goal can change. There's always a primary goal and a secondary goal, and those goals can change throughout the case. So even if the goal is changed to termination and adoption by relative or non-relative 6 months through, because the parent doesn't seem to be isn't starting to do what they need to do, that could still switch back 3 months later if the parent really gets it in gear. So that can switch back and forth. I would say from my perspective, that conversation is happening from the very beginning. As far as the goal, the formal goal is always going to start as reunification, but based on the history of the parents and just the situation, we can kind of see, or at least take an educated guess about where we think it's going to go. Now, I've been pleasantly surprised, a couple of times of parents that we just didn't think were going to be able to do what they needed to do, and they've turned it around. And then there's a couple of times where I've seen situations where I thought the parent was going to be able to have the support and seemed motivated, but just didn't follow through. So I think it's an ongoing conversation.
It seems pretty fluid throughout the whole case. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you mind, before we get into the more concrete, pragmatic, I would love to hear just a little bit about your story and how you came into fostering and how you even became a lawyer. I hear that there's
So, well, the second part's easy. I went to law school.
Well, yeah, that story's not so exciting. It's more like I thought I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer, and I'm not good at math or science, and so lawyer it was.
And you don't like blood.
There's nothing really
I love
exciting
washing
about
my
that.
hands 8 times a day.
My mom always did say that I was excellent at arguing, but I'm not sure that motivated my decision. No, but as far as becoming a foster parent and adoptive parent, and gosh, I just can't talk about it without smiling, because it's just been so amazing to see what the Lord has done in our lives personally. If you had told me 15 years ago that I was going to be an adoption attorney, I kind of, what? Because adoption was just not on my radar. It wasn't a big part of my life. I didn't grow up knowing a lot of people that were adopted. But my husband and I were going to a church around that time where, and I should say, I was a prosecutor. I was worked at the Dallas DA's office and the Hunt County DA's office, and my intention was to be a career prosecutor. But we went to a small church where there were a lot of families who were fostering and adopting, and I thought, hey, I'm an attorney. I can do adoptions on the side just to be a part of that ministry. And God really just started to grow that to the point where I was getting to do that a lot on the side, to the point where it was really almost too much to do on the side anymore. And then I had the opportunity, another attorney that went to that church offered for me to come over and join his practice and bring my adoptions and take over his wills and probate practice. And so that allowed me to go into full-time adoption attorney mode and to get on the wheel to start representing children. And then as I started to do that and started to see the need and seeing the kids that are sleeping in the CPS office because there's not enough foster homes.
That's crazy, isn't it?
You know, and my husband and I, we have our 2 biological children. We have our girl and our boy, and we were good.
Yes.
We did not need any more children. And so I really, at the beginning, felt like this is my part of the ministry to do adoption. But after you see the need, especially after I started representing kids in CPS custody and just seeing there's some just really amazing kiddos out there that need a home. They need someone to love them. They need someone to pour the love of Christ into them. They need truth spoken into their little lives. And so then it was kind of like, well, how could we not? And so I asked my husband if he would be willing to go to an adoption, just an information meeting or sort of see if God tugged at his heart. And there happened to be a really good one that was put on Focus by the family was putting it on locally. And so we went. And at the end of that, there were 2 little cards they handed out, a yellow one and a blue one. And the yellow one, it said, if you would commit to pray for this ministry. Yes. So I'm filling out the yellow one. I can pray. And I'll never forget my husband leaning over and saying, no, the blue one. And it was just sort of in that moment, and that was for people who are willing to get started in fostering. And so I as scary as that was for us, because it is, you know, for those of us who've been in this ministry for a while, it's, oh, okay. And, oh, you have another child. Who's this? You know, it's like no big deal. But at the beginning, it can seem like a really extreme thing to do, especially if you don't have a lot of people in your family or your community or friends who are fostering. It just can be kind of a real scary thing to get into. But in that moment, I thought, okay, if he's going to lead out in this, we can do it. We can do it. And I really did get to see, just from having the families at our church who did it, that it's not just for people who don't have kids. You don't have to be a super person to do it. Like it's just normal people living out the gospel in their homes. And, you know, once you get that second kid or the third kid or fourth kid, eventually it's your new norm, and it's totally doable.
I mean, you've already got 1 car seat. Why not add a second, right?
I mean, you know, and that's not, I don't mean to say that it's not completely overwhelming at times, because any number of children can be completely overwhelming at times.
Life is overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's just so worth it.
Being single and alone can be overwhelming. Like, I don't think the number of people in your sphere necessarily impact that. It has more to do with you and your ability to acclimate to whatever your environment is.
A good reference back to our podcast series on attachment and relationships.
Thank you, sir. Slant, what point?
Alley-oop.
Alley-oop? I don't know. Okay. So,
I don't even know what sport that is.
I was trying to think.
Happening.
I was thinking
set the ball. I was thinking volleyball.
I was thinking basketball.
I just set the ball for you at the
These
net.
both games have with ball.
Spike.
You spike it.
Spike. Set spike. I don't know.
Wow,
that's
off
probably
the rails.
Not going to make it into the
I
show.
bet that's great audio to listen to with all 3 of us yelling at each other simultaneously.
To be fair, we were yelling near each other, not at each other.
In the general direction of each other.
But we digress. That's beautiful. And I just like to encourage, we've talked about the number of kids that are in the system here in North Texas. And it is important to note, we talked about this a little bit, but it is important to note that when kids first come into care, the plan is always to try to reunite. And there's, there's a lot of folks out there that have strong opinions about the work that people do in foster care and adoption,
Yes.
especially if you're related to or somebody who have been involved with CPS. As a parent of a child that's been removed. And we want to be sensitive to you as well. The system is not perfect, but it's a system that we've got. And we've got some great people like Lauren working in it that are trying to make sure that kids end up where kids are supposed to be. And we hope that, if you're sitting there, maybe in a state of unhappiness with the system at this point in time, that maybe it will be some kind of solace to you to know that that folks like Lauren really are trying to do what's right by the kids and by the families.
Well, and let me say too that just from the legal perspective, it's been my experience that in almost every case, everybody really does want the birth parent to be successful, because we all know that generally, if the birth home can be a safe and stable environment, that's the best place for the children.
Right.
And so I think sometimes coming into the system, the birth parents especially feel like everyone is against them. And that's just not the case. Now, ultimately we're going to do what we need to do to keep the child safe and stable. And so that may mean we can't reunify. But I do think it's important for them to understand, and also for foster families to understand that, yes, at the beginning, that is the intention. And I tell, often I will have people, foster parents, who will come in and or just I call them clients, because they come in and for an initial consultation and they're interested in adoption, but they don't know what kind of adoption they think they might be interested in. And we'll talk about foster care, and they'll say, well, I just don't know if I could love a child and give them back. And I'm sure that's something that y'all have discussed on the show probably plenty before. And my response to that is always that if you could love them if you could have them and not love them and attach them, then we don't need you to be a foster parent. Like, we really need, because as an adult, you are equipped to grieve that loss. But as a child, they have to have that attachment for healthy development. And so if you can go into foster care with the goal of serving that child while that child is in your home, whether that is for 5 minutes or 5 weeks or for forever, then you will have served, you will have accomplished your goal. And so it's important for foster parents to remember that at the beginning, the goal is always reunification. And so their goal should just be to serve those kiddos. And yes, as you attach to them, it is hard, and you want to be more invested or more involved in what's going on in the court system. And there are certainly ways for foster parents to be more involved. But it's not necessarily they're not necessarily going to get an invitation. And so there's some things that they can do to be more proactive or to be more involved and stay up to date with what's going on with the court system.
I think there's a fine balance in a myriad of different ways. Emotionally, just that balance of the investment and the commitment to this child.
Absolutely.
And balancing my own emotions of grieving and loss and mourning when and should that time come, where they're returned or they're placed with a fictive or a kinship relative, that it's this push and pull of wanting to follow and do something because you feel called to, and then wondering if you're going to be equipped enough at the end to be able to manage through.
Absolutely.
In addition to the balance of how much do I advocate, how much do I use my voice, my passion, my desires for this child versus what does that look like within this system? This big, daunting, kind of intimidating thing where there's all these people coming into my house and there's court hearings and a judge and a gavel and a Bible. I mean, all these, I think our mind goes wild of trying to understand the unfamiliar. And so sometimes we put in really unrealistic expectations as a part of that while we're trying to navigate. So I know I want to be invested and committed to this child, so therefore I'm going to be their voice and I'm going to put out what their best interest always with these professionals, and yet it's 5, 6, 7 other professionals that I need to use my voice with or for, and I think that can feel really overwhelming sometimes as a foster parent,
especially if they feel like no one's listening.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and actually foster parents, and I don't know that they realize this, but foster parents can actually be really helpful in providing information to everyone. So we all know that CPS workers are busy and they're overworked. So as the attorney ad litem, I can't do my job if I don't know what's going on. And I don't always get that prompt email about what happened at school or, whatever's going on from the CPS worker. And so I love it when foster parents, when they send that email to their agency or to the caseworker, if they'll just include everybody on that email so that we all know what's going on, because we all have different roles to play. And so it may be that, CASA or CPS might take one position, while I might take a completely different position depending on what I think is in the best interest of that child. And maybe we're all going to be on the same page, but maybe we're not. And so just being able to provide that information to everybody, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And so I tell foster parents, whatever you type up for your agency, if you want to send it to me, I'd love to have it. I'd love to know what's going on with that child, from month to month, just so I can know what's going on. And I think sometimes they don't want to bother the attorney, or they just don't want to overstep their role or their bounds. But I appreciate that. I know maybe not all ad litems do, but they should.
Yeah, I love that tip. Absolutely.
So let's. So Lauren has a presentation that she's made various. I think over at Lake Point Church.
Yeah,
maybe,
they have a great. Let me just put a little plug for the Lake Point
Sure,
Adoption
go
Conference
ahead.
every year. It's so well done. They have just a range of professionals who speak on all kinds of topics, and it's for people who are interested in adoption, for people who are already fostering, and it's all types of adoption. So it's just a really great, very large conference that they put on every year that's well done. But yes, I do speak at that conference every year, and I'll do a class for introduction to just Adoption Law 101 for people who are just getting started, and then do Adoption Law 102, which is the legal aspects of foster care, because I found that I had a lot of foster parents coming to my 101 class because they had specific questions about things that were going on in their CPS case that they just didn't understand. And so getting into some of those topics was really too much for the Adoption Law 101. But I love that we started doing the second class so that we can really get into some of that nitty gritty and answer some of those questions that especially for those who don't have an attorney ad litem that is communicating with them, to be able to answer some of those questions for them.
Sure. Well, and so I'm looking at, I'm kind of flipping through the PowerPoint from that presentation. And I want to invite you to kind of hit some of the highlights from that presentation. I think the topics in here are very relevant. You've done a good job in putting this together. But we've kind of talked about the timeline a little bit. We didn't really go into the statutory timeline. We didn't go into a lot of detail, but I think maybe I think something that is on the mind of a lot of folks that are fostering and are maybe open to the possibility of adopting the children that they're fostering is kind of what happens around termination. Like, what are the requirements for termination? What is best interest of the child? How does all that kind of feed into that point in the legal case?
Right. Okay. So in order to terminate, we have to have two things. We have to have one, grounds for termination, and two, the court has to determine that it's in the best interest of the child. So the grounds for termination are statutory. There's a list of them in the Texas Family Code. The most common ones generally are going to be that the parent has failed to work services after 9 months. Maybe they have been sentenced or convicted of something that's going to be more than 2 years.
Is that set in stone more than 2 years?
It's
that
2
the
years.
statute?
They're going to be in prison, or that the sentence lasts longer than 2 years from the date of the filing of the petition. Mm-hmm. Some other just sort of ones that we see often are rights. Their rights have been terminated on another child for what we call D&E grounds, which are endangering grounds. And then also another common one that we see is that the parent has signed an affidavit of voluntary relinquishment.
Right.
So if and this happens a lot when we get to the end of the case, if a parent has not been successful in completing their service plan, CPS will offer what we call a Rule 11 or a mediated settlement agreement that basically says if you will agree to relinquish your rights, we will work with hopefully they're working with the potential adoptive family to come up with some sort of agreement for post-adoption contact, and whether that looks like maybe a visit a year if the parent has been drug-free, and if the family's comfortable with that, or maybe it's an email with a picture update twice a year. That can look like a lot of different things, but CPS will offer that if the parent will sign the affidavit of voluntary relinquishment, relinquishing their parental rights, that then they'll have this agreement for post-termination contact. So that's pretty frequent.
And that's usually known as mediation.
Well, it can
Or no.
It can happen at a mediation, but not always. So,
Okay.
If it's pretty clear the parent is not going to get there and the parent is willing to sign that affidavit of voluntary relinquishment, then they might just work with a CPS worker to figure out what that agreement is going to look like, and then they just sign it with a counsel sometimes, and sometimes not. It just depends on if an attorney has been appointed at that point. Now, if we're at a point, and this is usually if there is an attorney appointed where they're not quite in agreement, but CPS wants a trial, then sometimes we will do a mediation to see if we can come to some sort of agreement about post-adoption contact and whether the parent is going to be willing to relinquish. Yes.
And in my time, I'll say this. In my opinion, there's nothing more courageous or brave for a biological parent to make that decision.
Absolutely.
And to really honor that parent and the bravery it took to sign away. And I think more times not with the mentality of, I can't give this child what she needs, but I know this family can.
Right. And I tell families it can be really helpful. Some foster families are comfortable with this, some are not. But I've seen a lot more success with families who are willing to come meet the birth parent
forge
in
a
court
relationship.
at some point,
Right.
or if they will, start a notebook that you send back and forth in the diaper bag, or whatever arrangement they're comfortable with, but something so that they've developed some sort of rapport or relationship with the birth parent in advance, so that the birth parent isn't signing their rights to a completely unknown. If they can see that the child is being well cared for and that the foster parents really love that child, I think it can just make the difference at the end as far as them being willing to relinquish. And not everyone is comfortable with, not all foster families are comfortable with that. And honestly, there have been some times that I have said, I don't think it's a good idea.
It's a safety concern.
Right, for this foster parent to have contact with the birth parent just because of the birth parent's behavior. But in a lot of the situations, I have seen that has been very helpful.
Yeah, and it can be, you mentioned it's a brave thing for the biological parent to kind of relinquish those rights. It's also a brave thing for the foster parent or adoptive parent to lean into that and agree to that contact post adoption, right? Because
Absolutely.
I think we all kind of, well, I'm not going to say all, but many folks who have adopted from foster care that I've spoken with have at least a preliminary concern of, I want this to be final. Like when I adopt, I want the child to be mine. I want their birth history to disappear. And we do a lot of work as an agency, I think, trying to prepare families for the fact that you've got to honor that child's experience and you're joining into it, not erasing it.
Right.
So, it's bravery is an excellent word to use, I think, on both sides of that coin.
And keeping that link can really help too as the child gets older. Because when the child has questions, I tell foster parents all the time, right now, if the child is a baby, you may not feel like these visits really are for the birth parent. But as they get older, if the child is interested or has questions or wants to know that, where to find them, where to find the birth parents to be able to fill that gap for that child, and that can be helpful if you can keep in contact. Now, what I do see often is the birth parent will sign that Rule 11 for the post-adoption contact and then is never heard from again.
Right.
Now, that's certainly not in every case, so there's no guarantee of that, but it does happen a lot often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's. I want to try to move things forward a little bit. We're doing fine on time, and this is fantastic information. But you mentioned Rule 11 agreements. Let's just real briefly go ahead and touch on interventions. We've got kind of an agency position and stance on that, but I'd love for you to present, what intervention is, just kind of in a general way.
Okay. So I do get a lot of questions about interventions, just foster parents saying, what is it? Should I do it? An intervention is basically where the foster parent, instead of just being placement, hires an attorney and becomes a legal party to the suit. And sometimes I'll have foster parents call, and everyone is in agreement with what the goal should be, and the foster parent's in agreement with that goal too. And so in those instances, you really don't need one more attorney to say the same thing. It's in instances where the foster parent has real legitimate concerns about what's going on and doesn't feel like anyone's hearing them and feels like they need to get that information in front of the court, that they not need to talk to an attorney about intervening and actually having a legal voice. Now, back in 2017, the legislature made some changes that made it a lot harder for foster parents to get standing. Now you have to if you're a foster parent, you have to have had the child in your home for a year before you're allowed to intervene. And we're trying to get creative about that in cases where we need to try some other avenues if we really need to get in front of the court. But for the most part, the rule is for a foster parent, it's a year. And so what I tell people, if they're frustrated and they don't have standing to intervene and there is some legitimate concerns, some things that they could do instead is just first making sure that everybody knows the concerns. Because like I said earlier, maybe they're talking to the caseworker, but maybe the ad litem hasn't called them. Maybe they haven't heard from the ad litem the entire case. And so they're not talking to the ad litem. And maybe the ad litem doesn't know about the concerns. So maybe if they were to let everybody know, send an email to the CPS worker, these were my concerns. As we talked about, here's my concerns, and CC everybody. Let everybody know these are the concerns.
Yes.
And then if you don't get a response to that, maybe talking to the CPS worker's supervisor or just making sure that before you just kind of throw your hands up and give up, making sure that everybody first is aware of those concerns. And then, you talked about expectations earlier, kind of have low expectations because they are busy. There's lots of times where things are not done exactly the way that we feel like they should be. But it just kind of is what it is. And so you do your best and voice your concerns, but kind of maybe also pick your battles to a degree.
And this may not be true for you, but I tell families no case is ever the same. But because you're in it all the time, I'm sure you see some similarities.
We do see a lot over and over and over and over and over again. And a lot of the same concerns. And I'm with them every time. I totally, I'm able to say, I completely understand where you're coming from. Here's what I think is going to happen because this is what always happens and this is what we can do about it. One thing I should also mention, though, as far as what they can do, your agency, like you may not have a voice in the legal system and your agency may not have a representative in court every time, but your agency is your advocate.
Yes.
I mean, so make sure your agency knows what's going on. And a lot of times they're a step removed. As far as they don't have the emotional attachment to what's going on. And so they're able to see things a little more objectively and can help navigate whatever conflict might be going on that the foster parent needs help with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially if you're listening to this and you're a foster parent, adoptive parent in Texas, definitely lean on your child placing agency that licensed you. This whole part of the case where an intervention is not something that happens in every single case. It's actually, I think, pretty rare. But if you get to the point where you feel like that's the only avenue that you've got to do your part to ensure the child's best interest is played out, definitely do so under the support and the umbrella of your agency. And one of the things that you'll find here in Texas is that I'll say CK in particular, our agency. We support Child Protective Services and the Permanency Plan and the actions that they take in the legal sphere. We are a subcontractor of the Department of Family and Protective Services, and as such, it would be inappropriate for us to not. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't voice those concerns and we don't advocate, just like you said. But when the rubber meets the road, we are not an agency that encourages our families to seek intervention because frequently when someone's seeking intervention, it's I'm going to oversimplify this and say it's a family and kind of saying we think that Child Protective Services has it wrong here and we need to intervene and have a different outcome.
That's right.
Right. So let's move on to, let's see, what do I want to jump into here
Well,
next?
you look at Overshawn, I just want to revisit that, talking about no two cases are the same in that so many moving parts are in it. There's so many components, whether it's different CPS workers, different investigators, different counties and judge and DAs and all these other people to help solidify realistic expectations for families. So often I see, well, my friend's case, the ad litem came every month to check on, and we do this compare and contrast thing, which I think that can be really unhealthy. And so to break some of that, I say, it's different people. The game's the same, but the players are different. And so it's going to be different for you, and helping to normalize that we may not know because it's a different team than your friend's team.
Well, I was listening to you and I was thinking, if you want to guarantee your own unhappiness, look at what somebody else has.
Right.
And complain about how you don't have that.
I like that Apple Watch you have on, Brian.
Are you coveting?
And now all of a sudden you feel worse about yourself.
Oh, Lori, we have a no covet clause in our agreement here.
Does that mean I don't get one of these Covenant Kids mugs when I leave?
Oh, you can have two.
He only had one. He only had one made for himself.
And stickers. You can have stickers. You can have magnets. We'll be generous with the accoutrement.
You can take the microphone with you. Just
hold on.
It's a giveaway.
Yeah.
My
husband might like that, but I don't know what I would
do with it.
It's not a real.
No, just put it on your shelf like a trophy kind of thing.
It's not a real microphone. We're going to dub this later. We're just capturing your movement of your mouth. We're going to put
somebody who may or may not sound like you is going to say things that may or may not sync up with your lip movements.
So I think we need to try to be moving towards a conclusion, but there's a couple of topics that I want to hit. So I know that from my experience supporting foster parents, it was always a shock for me when I was a foster care case manager at an agency to have one of my families give me a call and go, "Great news! We just came back from court and the judge granted us PMC."
Yeah.
Right.
Which sometimes it's the way it happens.
Yeah.
The judge asked if we were willing to take PMC, and I looked at the CPS worker, and the CPS shook her head yes. So we said yes, and we came home with PMC.
Yeah.
Amazes me every time.
Yeah.
That happens, but it does happen.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. What is PMC? Let's start there, and then maybe talk about some of the pitfalls. Maybe if there's some good things around it, that sort of thing.
Okay. So PMC stands for Permanent Managing Conservatorship. And what happens is basically at the end of a CPS case, when there's termination, somebody is going to get PMC because somebody has to be the conservator or the custodian of that child. So if we're looking at adoption, then most often, CPS is going to take PMC, and then they're going to facilitate the adoption. There are some cases where CPS will ask the foster parents to take PMC, and then CPS dismisses out. I always encourage people to proceed with caution if they're asked to take PMC for a couple reasons.
Should be PWC. Do you see what I did there? Proceed with caution.
Right. Yeah, I like that.
Hold on. Wait for it.
There it is.
I thought we were going to get I would have mind blown.
You want one of those too? How about that?
Oh, nice.
And just for clarification, because I know in trainings this can get, with so many letters in this journey and acronyms, it can get a little confusing. Prior to the rights being terminated, that child has a status within the state of TMC for temporary managing conservatorship, saying that the state is going to be the conservatorship temporarily until a decision is made, whether that's reunification or another placement.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And so the reason I tell people to proceed with caution for PMC, for one, is if the child was eligible for benefits, and this is a huge one. So any child, if we're looking at adoption, we call it subsidy eligible. So if the child is either a white child a minority child 2 or over, a white child 6 or over, part of a sibling group, or has a mental or physical handicapping condition, that child is eligible for certain benefits that continue post-adoption. And that includes Medicaid until they're 18, a continued monthly subsidy, free college tuition to a state college for as long as the legislature continues that program. And that's for all CPS kids, but that's important as well. And then also CPS will pay for the adoption. So there's this package of benefits that are a great incentive that can be really helpful, especially if the kids have got some needs, lots of therapies and things like that Medicaid can be a huge deal. So if the family takes PMC, well, they may have custody of that child, but they don't get any of those benefits for that child. So you just lose eligibility for benefits, which is obviously a big deal. PMC is also, it says permanent, but it's permanent until a court says it's not. So it's kind of like getting...
That's good.
It's kind of like a
reusable
divorce.
Sticker?
No, I think...
Do I get a little button for that one?
Yeah. Oh, man, hold on. This one's for me for missing it.
No, I think that's really a fantastic point to make.
Yeah, because
it's
it's
permanent
kind of
until somebody decides it's not.
Yeah,
That's
it's
right.
like being in a divorce, except for now you're sharing custody with someone you were never married to and did
Yes.
not agree. I mean, it's with the birth parents because now if rights have been terminated, then you don't have to worry about the birth parents coming back and suing for custody. But usually CPS is asking a foster parent to take PMC because they're trying not to terminate parental rights,
Right.
because that's easier to convince the birth parents to agree to. That's easier to convince the birth parents to agree to taking possessory conservatorship and still having some rights rather than terminating their rights, which means that at some point in the future, the birth parent could come back and sue for custody to try to get the kids back. And then that CPS is not stepping in there, then it's the foster parents who are going to be bankrolling that custody battle.
Yes.
And so it's just, it doesn't give us the permanency that we want both for our family and for the child. Now, on the flip side, there are some instances where I would say it's appropriate to take PMC. If you've got a case where the birth parents have worked most of the services or all of the services, and we're in a position where we're looking at going to trial because they're not going to agree to relinquish because they worked all of the services, but the professionals and the foster parents or the placement still have some real legitimate concerns about that child's stability or safety, well, if we're afraid we're going to lose the trial, or if we think, not just afraid, because we're not going to operate out of fear, we're going to operate out of the belief that God is in control and that we're going to move forward in faith. But if we have some realistic expectations that there's a good chance that we would not be successful at trial, but we are really concerned about sending that child home, then maybe the best thing to do is to ask the foster parents if they're willing to take permanent managing conservatorship, with the expectation that, especially if the foster parents are willing to support reunification past adoption. Now that's a real calling but to just continue to kind of take over CPS's role. Or I have a lot of families that will come to me after they've taken PMC, maybe it's a year or two down the road, the birth parent really hasn't been involved and hasn't paid any child support, and when we just do a private termination and adoption.
Yes.
So even when you take PMC, there's still potentially the opportunity to adopt, but you're really signing up to potentially co-parent until that child is 18.
Yeah. And that was going to be my question, is that it does go to 18. Mm-hmm. What we've seen probably within the last 3 years is an increase, specifically in Tarrant County, of PMC cases starting younger and younger. I know 3 years ago, I was working a case with a 2-year-old boy, and they were really vying for PMC with the foster family. And it wasn't the first time that I was starting to hear this. And after that, it became quite a bit more common for younger
It's pretty common in Dallas County, too.
It is. Okay.
It is. And it used to just be that they would ask relatives to take PMC because that's a little bit of a different situation. But increasingly, I'm seeing CPS asking foster parents, especially in certain counties, to take PMC because it's just easier and faster than going to trial.
Okay, well, so let's move on to one more topic, and then I'll ask for kind of closing thoughts and maybe what we didn't talk about. But let's talk about, because you are an adoption attorney, let's talk about the costs of CPS adoption. I see you have a slide about that in your presentation here, and there may be some listening to this that are wondering, if I'm interested in maybe adopting from CPS, what kind of cost am I looking at? Okay,
well, first let me put in a plug as far as contacting an adoption attorney, because this is so important. I want to make sure we touch on it, and then I'll move on to the cost. But when is the right? I get that question a lot. When is the right time to contact an attorney? And you might get a different answer from every attorney. My suggestion to foster parents is that they contact an attorney as soon as they have the termination hearing, because there's a CPS policy that they want you to wait 90 days before you can finalize the adoption. But I'll have people wait that 90 days to call me, and then they say, we're ready for our adoption. And then I start asking for the order, and it hasn't been signed yet.
Yes.
And so I just encourage people, as soon as you have termination, contact an attorney. And let them start asking for that paperwork. And then I calendar it every 2 weeks and keep asking for that paperwork until I get it. And it just kind of keeps the ball rolling, especially because once you have termination and you're on the adoption road, it just doesn't have the CPS workers aren't as concerned about that case. And so it may kind of lag. So having an attorney who is there to help keep that ball rolling can really be helpful. As far as the cost, it really depends on the attorney. That's not super helpful.
I guess that was an easy answer.
Yeah. So again, like I mentioned, if the child is subsidy eligible, then the adoption is paid for through the state. The foster families just need to make sure that the attorney that they're contacting is contracted through the state to bill the state directly. So if I'm doing a subsidy adoption, the family, the foster family pays nothing out of pocket. It's the birth certificate's covered, everything is covered. So there's no additional expense for that. So I think that's an amazing benefit from the state, which I'm thankful for foster parents to they do so much already. I'm just thankful for them to not have to shell out the money, to have to pay for the attorney as well. Now, for those children who are not subsidy eligible, I would encourage people, as you're looking for an attorney, it's always a good idea to just, even if you're not going to have a subsidy case, ask the attorney if they're contracted with CPS to bill the state directly, because that's going to tell you if they do a lot of adoption. That's going to tell you, because I have seen attorneys who I know don't really practice adoption very much charge 3 and 4 times what I charge for an adoption, and they don't know. They don't know what to, and it just makes me so nervous. And then there are, a lot of that also will depend on the county that you're in Dallas County, or in Tarrant County, or maybe in Collin County. Sometimes the rates are a little higher, but not always. It really just depends. So sometimes it is less expensive to find an attorney in the county that you're adopting in, because you're not paying for travel. But depending on what county that is, it might actually be less expensive to hire an attorney from out of county, because they don't charge as much. So you just kind of ask. I think the Facebook groups, I know CK has a great Facebook group for foster parents, and there's several other ones I know that are popular, Chosen Ones, and a couple other Facebook groups. They can just be really helpful support. I know there's an ongoing dialogue there, like who's a good attorney for this area, and that's the best recommendation you can get is from other foster families.
I agree. We've got a good database, a good basket of attorneys that we use as referrals that have just been really good to us.
An agency is a good resource for finding a good attorney as well.
Absolutely.
Completely unrelated to the question, but I think I'm going to start referring to data sets as baskets.
I'm getting better with my timing.
You are. You
really
are.
Right? Hold on. Let me give myself a little.
Kudos to you.
Right?
Well done, Sean.
Ironically,
I just took your thing and made it about me.
But ironically, the applause you gave yourself for being better with your timing came 5 seconds after.
The children. Really quick before we get to closing thoughts, I would love if you just spent just a few minutes talking about what's coming up in November, which is National Adoption Day, NAD, and kind of what does that mean for you as a lawyer, and how do you feel about it? It was probably one of my favorite perks of this job was getting to experience that in different counties and just see the celebration and the communities rally behind something that's very near and dear to my heart. And so maybe just a few words on National Adoption Day.
Yeah, so I love National Adoption Day. It's just fun.
Yeah.
My primary practice is in Hunt County. Now, I go to Dallas and I go to Collin and I go to a lot of the surrounding smaller counties as well. But in Hunt County, when we do National Adoption Day, our judges dress up as superheroes. And I think there are some other counties that do that as well. And it's just fun. And I have a good friend who has a son that was adopted, and he still thinks Batman presided over his adoption. And it's
cool is
just
that?
I love
fun.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and there's usually balloons and cake, and so that's a lot of fun. And we do usually see a lull in adoption leading up to Adoption Day, because we're saving all of them for National Adoption Day. But honestly, like every single adoption I get excited about. It never gets old.
No.
Every single time it's exciting. And there are definitely some judges that do a great job as far as making sure the adoptions get to go first, having a little treat for the child and making it special. Our judges often will say some really nice things to the foster families, just thanking them for their commitment and what they've done. And so it's just a really special time all the time. But National Adoption Day is definitely fun, and we do look forward to that every year.
Do you know when it is in Hunt County?
I know it's in November.
Oh, put on the spot.
I don't know off the top of my head.
It's one of the middle weekends.
Hold on. She deserves this.
I'm not touching you. You.
Okay, I know Dallas's is November 23rd because I'm planning on being at that one.
Okay, that's great. Dallas is November 23rd. Excellent.
Mm-hmm. And then I may not have Hunts on my calendar yet, but I'll be there too.
Just talking about individual adoptions, I always tell our staff, specifically our clinical staff, if you get invited by the foster family you're working with to attend, cancel whatever sessions you have that day, do whatever you can do to get to that courthouse, because it's just such a silver lining to the emotional work that we all do and that this journey embraces. And so to get that kind of silver lining and just the window of some joy and celebration is really rewarding, I think, to all involved.
Right. And I really feel like it's the only time that we really celebrate foster parents.
Yes.
Because otherwise you're kind of in the foster parents are really in the background and you're expected to take excellent care of the child, to always be available, to basically do it all, but don't have anything to say, for the most part about anything. And so I love, one of the things I love about adoption is that the foster parent, you may take 2 or 3 placements before you actually get to adoption, but it's really, I feel like, the first time that at least in the court setting, that the foster parent really gets the credit that they deserve for all the hard work that they have done.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Amen.
Well, so I'm gonna ask us to have short closing thoughts today, but before we get to that, I want to give Lauren an opportunity to let folks know how they can reach out to her if you have questions, if you know the information we've provided whetted your appetite, or you're like, oh yeah, no, I need to know more about that. Where can they reach out to you to get their additional questions answered?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to screen those phone calls. Even if you're in a county that I don't come to, I have people who will just come to, if under certain circumstances we can do their adoption in Hunt County. And so it just depends on what they're at and what the circumstances are. But even if you're not in a county where I can represent you, I'm still happy to answer questions. And you can call me. My office is 903-455-1288. And my website is www.hudgenslawfirm.net. That's HUDGEONS lawfirm.net. I love to walk with foster families and to be able to answer those questions. So I'm always happy to answer those.
Excellent. You know, Ryan, I feel like you didn't have as much to say during this episode.
Yeah, I have strong emotional feelings that are complicated.
Well, I can understand that. And maybe we can get to those later.
I didn't even get a chance to. She did a masterful job because she didn't give me a single opening for a lawyer joke.
She is so good.
So I probably shouldn't have warned her in advance that I had a whole bunch of them.
That's right.
I warned you that lawyers like to talk.
Well, let's pretend like we're starting.
That I know.
Let's pretend like we're starting over. You can just drop one.
And
Okay,
she didn't
let's
even
hear it.
start a single answer with whereas, which is pretty impressive.
Oh, impressive or disappointing?
Both.
You were waiting
By
for
impressive, I mean disappointing. What closing thoughts, if any, do we have for the conversation? I'll say for myself, I think this has been fantastic, and I wish that we could go on, and perhaps we'll have opportunity to have you back in or phone into the show again in the future. You guys have anything?
Well, I was just wondering when you turned into somebody from England, because perhaps they'll give you an opportunity to phone into the show.
You're wearing
You even has a little man bun and everything. Yeah.
Is that English?
I hope
It
not.
is today.
For soccer, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, Gareth Bale, obscure reference. No, what I was going to say is if you are eligible to adopt in November, contact Lauren or somebody like that who can help you, because one of our 4 adoptions was on National Adoption Day in Tarrant County, and we actually got permission from CPS. We requested a waiver. He was in our home just a little over 5 months. He hadn't quite made the 6 months, but they waived the last 28 days or whatever, so we could do it. And it was fun. And the courthouse has balloons and superheroes, and he got to sit in the judge's lap and he banged the gavel on his own adoption, and the judge took pictures with us, and then the other, we also had some other counties, and it was like in the interest of, and like the judge was signing stuff, and it was just so anticlimactic just having a regular adoption. It was just a really great celebration on National Adoption Day, and so if that is an option for folks, I would highly recommend it because it's really special. We talk about it. My wife and I talking about last week about kind of how the judge treated us in the courtroom. So it makes a very special day even more special and memorable for the kids. So if you have a chance to do that, do. And if you're concerned about the lawyer fees, you guys usually waive your fees on National Adoption Day, isn't that right?
I think it's county to county, so I don't want people to call their attorneys and expect the attorneys to do it for free. But I think that certainly for any subsidy adoption, they're going to not pay anything anyway. And then for everyone else, it really depends from county to county.
mostly filing fees.
Let me rephrase that, counselor. In the county that we did ours, it was in Tarrant, and so part of that they did waive the fees, so that was pretty.
There
fun.
are several counties that will do that.
Yeah, and she came out to the house and got to know him and everything, and wasn't involved in our case at all. But I don't even remember her name anymore. But she's put a lot of effort into making the day special for us that she didn't have to do. So yeah, it was very cool.
But there's a lot of people that go into to making this whole thing work. And, we certainly appreciate the time that you have spent with us today. Lori, you have anything?
You're stealing my closing thought. Just so much gratitude and appreciation for you taking precious time to come and spend here with us today. It's just selfishly, it's just been a real honor to have you in here and gaining expertise and wisdom. I just appreciate you in terms of your faith and your drive and your passion for the children. It's always nice to be reminded that there are good people involved in the system of all of this, and to put a face to a name and a voice on the airways for those families that really are feeling in the trenches or maybe the frustrations of this journey, to be reminded that you do have people in your corner for you. And so thank you for being one of those people.
Well, you're welcome. And I will say it is a tremendous blessing to me to see over and over again, because I live, the foster parents who are frustrated or are worried for those kids, I live that with them every single case. So I may not be in their home, but I'm feeling it. And so I've just seen cases over and over and over again where I'm saying, Lord, I'm worried about this. I'm concerned about this child going home, or I'm concerned about this issue. And I've but I don't know what to do about it. And there's nothing, and that's sort of the position of a foster parent often, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, even as the ad litem, I may not see a legal avenue that I can take that will resolve the issue.
Right.
And I just see God move the mountains over and over and over again. And so it has just been such a tremendous blessing to have a front row seat, to see the Lord work in these kids' lives, to just change their lives over and over again. So it's been such an amazing blessing to be able to do that. And I'm so happy to get to be a part of that, and that people choose to call me and allow me to be a part of their adoption story.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Well, guys, I think that's going to bring this episode to a close. And in closing, I want to thank you all again for listening. And we are trying to grow the show. So if you like what you hear, feel free to give us a like, share us, tweet us,
subscribe,
share us.
Share us with others.
Share us. Don't keep us to
like
yourself.
You that
would be very
We should
selfish.
start a social network called Share Us.
Share us. Share us. It may exist. We might ought to research what shareus.com is.
Don't Google it yet, anybody.
Don't Google it yet.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Can you say upon advice of counsel, don't Google that on your company network?
On advice of counsel.
She did it. She did it.
But he's not on your company network.
Yeah, you can find our podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. We're on Apple, we're on Google, we're on all of the other little directories that are out there. We also put out a video of this that we publish on YouTube and Facebook. You can find us either of those locations, and sometimes little snippets and clippets on IGTV. I'm rhyming today, baby.
Clippets.
Snippets and clippets.
You're inventing words today.
Hey, every day.
Day.
So, but anyways, thank you guys for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again next time.
Bye.